Australians would have heard of tall poppy syndrome, which is a cultural phenomenon very closely associated with Australia, or synonymous with Australia, um, whereby people who've achieved some form of success or notoriety in their fields are cut back down to fit back in with the rest. Right? Quite interestingly, in 2004, a Macquarie University academic, Bert Peters, he described tall poppy syndrome as, in Australian discourse, so the way it's spoken about by Australians as, quote, usually individuals who, on the basis of unwarranted self-adulation, itself a consequence of success, amassed fortune or fame and have become targets for criticism. They become the victims of a widespread tendency known as tall poppy syndrome to scrutinize high achievers and cut down the tall poppy. So in a sense, what Peters is saying, or how he's describing tall poppies, and by believing, so the people who are engaging in tall poppy syndrome, by believing that the tall poppies somehow deserve it, they feel better, or they feel okay about engaging in this sort of flagellation of these people to bring them back down. More recently, in 2018, a quite depth Canadian research study called The Tallest Poppy, they began their 32-page report this way. Tall poppy syndrome is a term commonly used in Australia, referring to flowers that grow higher than others, being cut down to size by the shorter flowers around them. This study shows that the syndrome is also alive and well in Canadian companies, and the result is particularly devastating to female employees. So some of the findings that this research had was, well, it was a survey style study, and they had 1,501 respondents, all female, because they were looking at the impact on female. And in a wide variety of fields and work environments, ranging from entry-level positions to senior managerial positions. 87% of respondents said that they had been the targets of tall poppy. And they said that they were attacked by both men and women, almost equally. 43%, so almost half, said that their friends and social network took part in the cutting back down. And the impact of this, not only on the people's psyche and their emotional mental health, is it obviously impacted their productivity. 70% said it affected their ability. Got low self-esteem. Around half said it discouraged them from wanting to seek a promotion because all did get attacked. And 4 in 10 admitted to watching a tall poppy getting attacked and saying nothing. And 10% admitted to participating. So sorry to throw all these numbers at you. I won't have so much numbers, but just to give you an idea of how pervasive it is. Qualitatively, so more interesting to me, is how the respondents talked about it. So the words they used were things like death spiral. It sent them on a death spiral. They had a loss of confidence. They got insomnia, illness, PTSD. They felt rejected. They felt unsafe and constant threat, hopeless, and some had complete mental. And these are a few direct quotes from a number of different people. I became very depressed, developed uncontrollable tics, began to drink to cope, and had to seek therapy. I'm forced to choose between mental health and continuing to be a high achiever. I try hard not to stand out. I dismiss my own accomplishments at work. I don't want to attract attention. I just want to do my work and try and curb compartmentalized bitterness. It made me so nervous to go to work and to care about what I do. So that is a Canadian survey, and it's it is both focused on a more office style atmosphere, but as some of those statistics I got you earlier suggest, namely that respondents said they were undermined by both men and women, and that they were undermined by their friends, social network, as well as people they considered just shows syndrome extends well beyond the office environment and into spaces that many people who don't work in offices would work in, namely cultural pursuits, education. And so this is where I'm going to play with the term a little bit and introduce my idea of this medium poppy syndrome, using artistic license, because technically a tall poppy is anyone who stands out even a little bit, right? You're either tall or you're not. But sadly, and this is perhaps, as we sort of touched on in the previous session, it's sadly prevalent in progressive spaces. And even within that, marginalized spaces, such as intersectional feminism, which I start to use with air quotes now. Just strayed so far from what it's meant to be, but other activist spaces, spaces of racial advocacy. Poppies don't even get to grow tall enough to be noticed by the outside world outside this space, right? So they don't even they show potential to grow. So which I mean in this to be noticed outside of their environment before they're cut down by their own community. Then to lead into this discussion, I want to highlight one more finding in that Canadian study, which is that when asked why they thought they were attacked, 83% of respondents cited envy or jealousy, right? Just below, or a little bit below that, at 68%, gender stereotype. And so there were other factors like the culture of the organization, ignorance on the part of the. But I want to focus on the envy and the gender. So keep in mind, as I said, women were said to cut down other women. In April 1976, the US feminist organizer Jo Freeman wrote an essay in Ms. magazine that became its most popular article, up to that point, and it attracted more letters to the editor. And that was called, if she'd written it now, we can say it would be viral, basically. And that was called Trashing, the Dark Side of Sisterhood. And in it, she defines trashing as, it's not disagreement, it's not conflict, it's not opposition. These are perfectly ordinary phenomena which, when engaged in mutually, honestly, and not excessively, are necessary to keep an organization healthy. Trashing is a particularly vicious form of character assassination. It is manipulative, dishonest, and excessive. It is occasionally disguised by the rhetoric of honest conflict or covered up by denying that any approval exists at all. But it is not done to expose disagreements or resolve differences. It is done to disparage and destroy. So she goes on to describe her own experiences within feminist, liberation group in Chicago, and to the point, got so bad and so taxing on her mental health that she dropped out. She just stopped, and she was said she was permanently psychologically scarred. Other people, like I mentioned earlier, were saying, and she just couldn't function for a long time. And then she goes to give her theory as to why it is among, the sisterhood. The primary reason there have been, so quote, the primary reason there have been so few great women is not merely that greatness has been undeveloped or unrecognized, but that women exhibiting potential for achievement are punished by both men and women. The fear of success is quite rational when one knows that the consequences of achievement is hostility and not praise. Not only has the women's movement failed to overcome this traditional socialization, but some women have taken it to new extremes. To do something significant, to be recognized, to achieve, is to imply that one is making it off other women's oppression, or that one thinks oneself better than other women. Though few women may actually think this, too many remain silent while others unsheath their. I want to repeat a little bit of that. The reason there have been so greatness has been recognized, but women who exhibit that potential are punished by both women and men. And since that was written in 1976, I will update that and say, I would say all genders, because this behavior that I'm about to discuss is, I've spoken to people from different activist backgrounds, activism, all talked about very. So it's definitely a human phenomenon. They're cut down before they can achieve anything, just by showing that spark. Not because they're tall, but because they have the medium side. And what I'd really like for guys to take away from today is so many women, and I'd say women in the layer of oppression, difficult to understand. I use the word, still trying to phase out my gender, that one slipped out. They're deliberately destroyed and derailed because their peers are envious. Right? So they, in a sense, rather sink the ship and see someone else at the, however briefly. And this phenomenon isn't limited to. So in 1977, the late great feminist Nawal el-Saadawi in Egypt published The Hidden Face of Eve, which was a non-fiction account of women's situation in Egypt and its neighboring countries. And she reflects, one of the women that she reflects on is a writer and poet and a visual artist, fine artist, May Ziada, who was the daughter of a Lebanese father, Palestinian mother, and who, at only 20 years of age, in 1915 in Cairo, said, salon where writers of the day would come, discuss their ideas. Sadly, so the more, the more that she sort of gave, the more she became ostracized by people who didn't necessarily want to see that coming from a woman. And I'll quote what el-Saadawi writes. May Ziada's life ended in a small flat in Cairo, where she died while still in the freshness of her youth, with no one by her side, abandoned, misunderstood. She left behind her writings, poems, paintings, and the lectures she had delivered in Egypt and Lebanon about literature, art, and the emancipation of women. An exceptional talent and gifted artist, she was rewarded for her genius by loneliness, accusations of madness, and an early death. May's fate, in all its sadness and cruelty, is no different from the fate of any woman who is a pioneer and tries to change the behaviors of society towards women. It is no different from that of the intelligent and even brilliant women who were tortured and burned in the Middle Ages, accused of madness or sin or witchcraft. Nor is it any different to the fate of so many clever and gifted women whose only reward for their outstanding qualities is terrible loneliness or accusations of abnormality or madness. So 7 years before Saadawi wrote that, half the world away, an Italian-American feminist, Anselma Dell'Olio, delivered a speech called Divisiveness and Self-Destruction in the Women, where she wrote, or she said, I learned years ago that women had always been divided against one another, self-destructive and filled with impotent rage. I thought the movement would change that. I never dreamed that I would see the day when this rage, masquerading as a pseudo-egalitarian radicalism in the movement to strike down sisters, singled out. I am referring to the personal attacks, both overt and insidious, to which women in the movement who had painfully managed any degree of achievement have been subjected. These attacks take different forms. The most common and pervasive is character assassination, the attempt to undermine and destroy belief in the integrity of the individual under. Another form is the purge. The ultimate tactic is. And who do they attack? Achievement or accomplishment of any kind would seem to be the worst crime. Do anything that every other woman secretly or otherwise feels that she could do just as well, and you're in for it. But this is getting a little repetitive, it's meant to, because I want to show how different people from different contexts around political context, social context, religious, racial context have come to these similar conclusions. bringing me back to Australia, I do think medium poppy syndrome is endemic here in writers and activists, in progressives, in particular, sadly, among writers and activists, and possibly even particular again women of color. And the reason for this is structural. We have a small population in Australia. There's limited funding. There's limited opportunities. There's limited space, right? And that, despite the fact that we talk about our movements and that we're working together and we're collaborating and we're allies and we're this and we're that, it still fosters a quite a competitive environment, which we're not supposed to refer to as competitive, but it's kind of there. And B is because we are so white dominated in, you know, every sort of industry, everything. Right? There isn't. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's part of, yes, definitely. You know, I was kind of trying to get to that, but it's the sense of, if I lift her up or if I let her rise, what happens to me? There's only so much room, right? There's only so much room. Better to bring her down, and maybe I'll rise or maybe I won't, but at least we'll all be in here together. But then what's the end result of that? Stay down. So because we are like so white dominated, I mean, there's still like 70%. Is it something of the whole country is from like Western Europe or you know, delineated from that. So it makes it more difficult, unlike, you know, West, where it is, you know, there are more opportunities for people background to get together and achieve some sort of, you know, some, you know, what do you call it, success or progress, you know, however you define success. You know, so I'm like, no, like, it's no surprise to me that my book is so much more critically by people, you know, in terms of sales, but also more importantly in how people responded to it. And I knew, like I mentioned this earlier, and I knew, I suspected that it would be because of these factors that I've spoken about. And that's why I worked so hard before the book even came out here. You know, when I told my agent here, I don't, you know, give worldwide Australian publishing name, in particular American rights. I want to retain those rights. I want to work directly with the US so that we can get the book, you know, in a way that is going to most likely, you know, speak to people over there, because it's the same book, but I do cut back a little bit on the Australian context and Australianism, and, you know, use less examples from Australia, more examples from the US, so that they can, you know, be like, oh yeah, I know who she's talking about. I know what she means, rather than be like, oh, I've never heard of these people. Who's Kerry Ann Kennelly? You know, that sort of a thing. So yeah, so and it was not to say that I didn't get, you know, some wonderful feedback here. Can we just do the questions at the end? Oh, you can't hear? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's fine. It's not to say that it was, you know, like a complete bomb here, but it was hard for me to, I guess, appreciate that because the ugliness that came with it, right? Straight off the bat, like pretty much the day the book or the day before the book came out, it started. And I'll discuss my some of my experiences a little bit later. But as I said earlier, I've spoken to a number of women, you know, brown and black women, who've experienced this kind of thing. Because whenever I talk about my experiences in this sort of context, I'm not trying to give a sob story. It's when I can relate what has happened to me, or is what's happening to me, is it something that's just to do with this context, or is there a wider social phenomenon at play? And that's how I got to my book, right? So, you know, there's one of the women I spoke to, Ash, who's a South Asian, a brown woman, Fijian Indian woman, and beauty blogger, who in 2018, she set up an Instagram page, and she wanted to use it to highlight, you know, the whiteness and makeup industries. And her page quickly, like really rapidly gained popularity, right? So, and then with popularity comes scrutiny. And someone set up, or some people set up, a hate page against her on Instagram, which, I mean, I haven't had that. So there's always people that are experiencing things on an even, more full-on level. And she traced it back to other non-white people, right? Also in the beauty and makeup space. And the page was up for a year, and I did see it, right? I did see it. And it was up for a year before it was taken down, but not before they doctored, messages. They Photoshop pretending that she was like messaging them and saying racist and quite, awful things. But it spread to like some parts of the progressive media, so she was vilified in the media, and she only got like a partial retraction. And so I'll quote Ash here. It says, "I was told several times that South Asian women always get shitted on, and that being disruptive will only bring you hate." Fortunately, she didn't give up for her, though. So, some people will keep going no matter what. And she says, here's the thing I've learned in the last year. If you speak up and you're a woman, you will be called toxic, bitter, aggressive, and a bitch. If you're a woman of colour, be prepared. You'll be lucky if anyone gives a damn at how you feel, including other women of colour who, because of the scarcity mindset, feel threatened by your voice. Simply put, they wish they could do what you do. White people aside, be careful of whitewashed POC who will defend white supremacy when you speak up. Unpack, unlearn, and keep going. So not everyone is as stubborn and determined to press. Since I've become more vocal experiences and my treatment at the hands of other progressives, I've had a number of people contact me privately saying, this has happened to me and I can't do it anymore. People in their 20s, right? They're just starting out. Like, imagine what they could give. And the fact that it does affect them so deeply in a way shows that they're the people we want, because you can see that it hasn't just hurt them on like this professional level. They're really deeply impacted because they wanted to make a difference, but what they're giving is just so unappreciated, and that they're just, well, like, I can't do it anymore. So what they all had in common is it wasn't all white, straight, cis people attacking them. And so what I want to do now is I want to differentiate between what I'm trying to talk about. Right? So the Canadian Race, or Canada again, I apologize. So the Canadian Race Relations Foundation describes lateral violence as displaced violence directed against one's peers rather than adversaries. This construct is one way of explaining minority on minority violence in developed nations. It is a cycle of abuse, and its roots lie in factors such as colonization, oppression, intergenerational trauma, and the ongoing experience of racism and discrimination. Now, I'm not saying that isn't part of this, but I'm also thinking that, like, what I'm thinking of also occurs without that. So, as that Canadian study that I mentioned earlier discussed, that it happens to people who don't necessarily come from a marginalized racial background. And lateral violence often occurs within family structures. So it's kind of more of a lashing out at people within your community because you lack the power to really direct it at as your oppressor. And so, there's an element of structural trauma in sort of what I call medium poppy syndrome, absolutely, because it's occurring in a context where we're still in a very sort of white-dominated society. But, this is where I bring back in that concept of envy, right? The very human concept of envy. And allowing envy or resentment or whatever, they're quite similar emotions, to sort of override your empathy and to override your connection, and to, basically stop you, enabling you to see that you can actually benefit from lifting someone else up. So, this is a more strategic, manipulative aim to bring down someone else so that, maybe if they don't shine so bright, you don't, you can look brighter by comparison. So in this context, I like the metaphor of the crabs in a bucket. And so that's a metaphor that uses the sort of observed behavior of crabs when they're, poor things, when they're placed and trapped in a bucket. So the New Zealand researcher Simon Spacey in 2015, he defined crab mentality as a behavioral characteristic wherein someone tries to pull down those who are performing better than them. The term comes from watching crabs in a fisherman's bucket. The fisherman can leave the bucket without a lid, secure in the knowledge that every time a crab makes progress towards its escape, the others will go out of their way to pull it back down. So if women of colour in this metaphor are the crabs, who's the fisherman? All they have to do is sit back and watch us devour ourselves. And the impact of this crab's mentality, or this crab in a bucket mentality, is staggering. So Simon Spacey's research focused on university students and how they performed in New Zealand exams. And what he found is that they're more likely to perform poorly in an environment where they can expect some kind of retaliation for performing well. So, and he puts forward New Zealand as like Australia, somewhere where, crabs, the tall poppy syndrome is quite justified. So if they feel like, if they know that they're likely to be bullied for standing out, they'll pull back on their effort. And what he found is that when grades are not disclosed publicly, 18% better, averagely. An average of 18% better, just by knowing that they're not going to see my marks, so I'm free to achieve. And so what he showed is that, this idea of a name and shame system, right? So it's kind of like, well, if we put the marks up, people will want to work harder because they will want to see, they wouldn't want to do badly in front of their peers. But it has the opposite effect. The people who are shamed are the high performers. So it has that opposite to desired effect. And, in workplace situations, what that tallest poppy study found, they advised companies, it sounds basic, but it's simple, to show support and empathy to all their employees, rather than fostering this cutthroat competitive environment, which ends up having the opposite, similar, right? The opposite to desired effect, rather than, healthy competition. Knowledge, that we can feel, sometimes we can feel envious, we can feel a bit of resentment, and we can maybe allow it to cloud our judgment, to cloud our empathy, to cloud our connection with others. And, so they concluded that women in particular need to know that they're supported and appreciated so that they can feel like they can give everything that they have. So when I was targeted, like, when you do this kind of work and writing, you're targeted all the time, right? But when it really sort of came to a head was around, I mentioned earlier, when my book came out. And so I expected, it's called White Tears, Brown Scars. So I expected white people, and in particular white women, because I was focusing on the interactions between white women and men. Obviously expecting them to feel some kind of way about it, and I sort of would understand that on the surface of it, even though, the work is actually read and read closely, it would be apparent, I hope, that it is very much a critique of power dynamics, and it's not it's not isolating identities or, individual personalities. And that happened, absolutely. But what was really damaging was the attacks from other people of colour, in particular other women of colour, in particular Arab women, because I'm Arab. And if we go back to that crabs in the bucket, and also to what Simon Spacey said, he said, people are less likely to jump in and intervene where they see a cultural justification for crab mentality. So if Arab women are attacking another Arab woman, well, this is their thing. So we can't interfere with this. Even though I would say, look at what's actually being said. Is it an actual agreement? Are valid points being brought up? Or are they just tragedy? Are they just character assassinating? And it was confusing, right? Because I thought I was doing a good thing with that book. And so I thought that I was expecting people to just like, sort of like heap praise on me, but I thought they'd have my back. Right? Because obviously I needed it at writing something like that. And what was really bewildering is that some of the attacks came from people that I'd helped. I'd helped their career. I'd introduce them to editors. I'd help them edit their stuff to get it, ready for deadline. Sometimes I'd ask to do a TV spot. If I didn't think I was the best person, I'd suggest someone, and I'd always suggest someone who's emerging, someone who's trying to come up, to give them that chance to be like, you go, this is right up your alley. You should do this. And I like to do this stuff behind the scenes, right? And sometimes that can work against you, right? Like it can, because it's easy for people to pretend it doesn't happen or to deny it. But I try not to sort of perform that kind of stuff. But it can, it can work against you. But now I'm getting off track. So anyway, but not only did they not have my back, but like, they kind of threw me to the wolves, and in some cases they were the wolves. And it felt really personal. And because some of the attacks were like some of the things that were said. Well, if you go on Twitter, I'm sure, and you scroll down enough, you'll find some stuff. Like it's still there. Very few of them have deleted it. But it's as personal as it felt. When I look back at my experiences and I contextualize it with what some other women have told me, and not just women, but I do focus on women. And looking at the research I've done for this, right, all of the quotes I've just read, you see that it's really feels personal, and in some cases it is, but it's really just more about trying to sort of pull you back down because you stood out, and if you stand out, will I ever get the opportunity? How many Arab women does he listen to? If they listen to you, this is sort of, and this is where we come back into this whole idea of what the system that we've been sort of into. And what's disappointing about it is that I wish, obviously wish they'd chosen a different path, and so sort of turning that scrutiny onto me, if they'd sort of backed up the work that I'd done, that maybe we could be at a different place in how we talk about race in progressive spaces. Because I finished that book up with more than half a dozen questions that I aim at white women, and I sort of white feminists in particular. I say, question, like. We need to talk about this in order to move forward. So rather than backing that up, I'm the one that got all the attack, and so it kind of it took that onus, right? It took that pressure off where I think it should be. And so I think, and where that whole idea of scarcity and crowd mentality comes into this is, it's very hard to give that kind of credit sometimes to someone you see as your right? It's much easier to, cite and acknowledge and credit, someone working in the US, right? Who's a US author, someone who was, writing 40 years ago. Men, even if you're a woman, it's easy to credit men because you don't see them as one of you. And surprisingly rare to see people be able to just sort of give that, and I don't mean lip service, I mean really build on critical piece of engage with it deeply. And the tragedy of that is, like, when we trash the contributions of our contemporaries, what does that do for how the future sees us? Are they getting an accurate perception of all the work that was done and the inroads that were made or partially made, but then were abandoned because people decided they didn't like the person? In the 1960s, back to the 60s, so T. Grace Atkinson, she resigned from a feminist group that she had started, and with the now, quite famous words, "Sisterhood is powerful. It kills, mostly sisters." 40 years later, the author Susan Faludi said, those words are among the most quoted by feminists. So this is how deeply this stuff trenched and how deeply it cut. And yet we're still allowing it to flourish. We're not stepping in when we see people we're so afraid that it might be us, but eventually it might be. There's only so much you can do. Didn't Audre Lorde say, "Your silence will not"? And aren't those also some of the most famous words quoted by other feminists? And this is where I would ask women, non-white women, women of color, to free ourselves of an idea that none of the worst successes of whiteness can apply to us, because they can, because we live in society that rewards people who endorse the status quo. This is just how simple it is. And we can be quite vicious. But what's a little pathetic is that, we get less reward for it. Because when white women can, appeal to whiteness, appeal to the status quo, they can benefit themselves as individuals, but they'll also end up benefiting white women as a group. Obviously not every single white woman, but as a group, they'll make it easier for white women but that won't work for us because, a white-dominated society isn't going to bestow privileges, benefits on a group as a whole that isn't white. It will allow some individuals through. So, to wrap up, as I noted earlier, I tried to use as many examples, different countries, continents, eras, decades, and aspects of them. Workplace, corporate work environment, to literature, to activism. So I'm going to finish music because, pop culture to me, especially music and especially rap music, because they're so open, right? If you look at rap lyrics, and even when you sort of try to dig deep into, rap stars are quite big on their beefs, and you dig deep into it, so it shows you so much, about, things that are usually close to you, right? Because we don't talk about them. They put it out there. Just no surprise to anyone who follows me on Instagram. I'm always quoting Nicki Minaj. So I'm gonna finish with some lyrics. I'm gonna finish with some lyrics from her third mixtape, right? Beam Me Up, Scotty. She released this in 2009. So it was a year before her debut album, right? So she hadn't even released a proper studio album, which is to say she hadn't crossed over into the mainstream. She wasn't a tall poppy yet. But if you look at the lyrics in this mixtape, she was already discussing pretty much all the issues that I've just brought up. Right? And she's talking about it in her own experience and how it left her feeling confused because what's going on? So I'll read out some of the lyrics, okay? And it was other people in hip hop and other women rappers as well that were participating in it. So in the song Envy, which she structures as a kind of confrontation with one of the people that's trash talking her, part of it is, why did you envy? Why did you go against me? When I got trendy, why you ain't commend me? Why when I needed it, why you couldn't lend me? Why was you secretive, fronting like you're friendly? Why did you fear that? You held my career back. In Can Anybody Hear Me? Which is a song that she delivers as incited conversation with God. She says, do you do what you made me? Everything that you gave me, but I don't want to do it no more. I sort of lost sight of what I'm doing it for. Thought that I was doing something good for the game until they all started throwing dirt on my name. And I'll close it out with some lyrics from her song Still I Rise. A language warning on this, but I'm not going to censor her. She says, bitches is like crabs in a bucket. You see a bad bitch getting shine, you should love it. Because every time the door opens for me, that means you just got a better opportunity to do you. Did I go over? I have no clock, by the way. I have no idea how far over I've gone. Okay, no, we're good. Now, is there a Q&A on this, or do I just leave? If anyone has questions, it's up to you. I guess I'm cutting into although I was told to go till 12:15, so I guess we have about under 10 minutes, if there's any questions. Yes. Look, I I will say, if I'd known what it was going to be like, I wouldn't have come into this. Um, I started writing, so I was like writing in the media for 10 years before I wrote, more than 10 years before I even wrote a book. And social media wasn't what it is now. So we just used to joke about not reading the comments underneath the articles, right? Which is easy to do. It's harder to avoid when someone's tagging your name on Twitter and Facebook, right? And you're seeing all this stuff, and then you make the mistake of trying to engage and trying to like sort, because you think it's a misunderstanding and you try to sort it out. It's not a misunderstanding. Like, it's a bait, right? And so so I was fortunate in that respect, and maybe also because I did come into it a bit older. In my 20s, I was backpacking and partying. Like, I wasn't doing this stuff. So maybe being older allowed me, to get some of that strength. But also, it's just the way it unfolded that I didn't quite know the depth of it. I really didn't, like, and how widespread it was. I just thought there was this few isolated cases, and as it kind of snowballed and got bigger, I was just like, holy, like, but you do kind of think, like Nicki Minaj said, I don't want to do it. But some of us somehow, she kept going, and, she became Nicki Minaj. So it's, as I said earlier, I think I'm good at it, why should I stop something like that? Because it makes some people annoyed, and rather than actually, if they think I've done something wrong or I misstepped, I'm always open. And that's one of the things that upset me, because I am open to criticism. And I've taken it on board, and I've gone back to my editor and I said, someone's brought up a really good point. Can you change this article? Not many people do that. I do that, right? So it's such a hard question for me to say, because I know how hard it is. And I, as a adult woman in my 30s and now 40s that was going through that. So someone in their 20s, I mean, I guess, that we need to foster like a tight, group of people that we trust around us. But I think it's something that we can only move on from it if we don't just rely on coping strategies. That we have to move away somehow from this, allowing this to happen. How are we supposed to society if we treat each other like this, right? It's no surprise to me now that we're not really making as many inroads as we could be, or we really should have, I guess, by now, given how many great people there are working. And I'm sure a lot of the, people that sort of stay out of this stuff when it happens, they're not bad people. Very few people are bad people. We get caught up in things. We're afraid to speak up, or maybe we believe it, if someone's saying this person did this really horrible thing, you've never met them, you don't know, so you believe, you might believe it, you don't know, like, so I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, but this is only because it's, crowd mentality, it's a group mentality. We have to address it as a group sort of issue in how, maybe get off Twitter. I don't know, like, that's such a breeding ground. But look, I know it has a good side. I know it does, but it makes it very easy to happen. Let's just say that. It is very easy to misrepresent tweets, or to tweet something, intending it one way before it to be construed in another. And but I would say also just really think about, what you do. If you love it and there's nothing else you can do, then it's about trying to filter out that. And one of the things that helped me is knowing, as I was looking back on all this, looking at, Nicki Minaj is one artist that I spoke. There's so many singers and artists of all sorts, that poets, that go through stuff like this. So this is widespread. So there's all, that thing of knowing you're not alone kind of helps. But I think it's one of those things, like, when I wrote about that sort of white tears, it's like, we need to talk about this out in the open, because in Australia we really weren't, overseas they were. Because if we don't, then it's happening, and we're going to pretend that. So I'm hoping that, we can start talking more openly about things like this, and not in a way that is just sort of just like repeating the behavior. It's more about this is kind of something that happens when humans get together. How can we foster an environment of true collaboration, healthy competition? And, as Nicki Minaj said, realizing that someone lifting up doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to stay down. Like, if they're doing the work with intent, they'll take you up with them. yeah, we need to talk about it, right? Because if you don't, then you, like it becomes trauma. And look, in our context, yes, but there's a reason why I put in that quote from Nawal or Sadawi, because this is a human behavior, and I think the context you're in determines who benefits most from it, right? So the context that she was writing in, Nawal El Sadawi, is men. Egyptian men were the beneficiaries. In our context, yes, it's colonialism, so it's whiteness are the greatest beneficiaries, and we again, it's a hard thing because I don't want to say it's all up to us to get out of the bucket, and then racism or whatever, all inequality is over. That's not how it works, because if the fisherman sees crabs escaping, he's going to put the lid on it, right? So obviously it's an imperfect analogy in that regards, but it's about, yeah, the change has to come from the, but also within us in how we move with each other and in the spaces that we create, which is supposed to be away from you. And so it's that melding of sort of some of the more or the less savory attributes of human. We're unhuman, we feel it's an emotion. We're going to feel it at some point. It's a matter of how we deal with it and how we act on it. But yes, there's this definite sort of work that needs to be on the ground level. But there's always room for how people power who are back and watching stuff happening, what they're willing to do to. Yeah. I'll try to keep it brief. I rattle a lot. Yeah. Yeah. I think, and Jo Freeman talks about that in her essay, where she says that um, there's this sort of inability to want to accept how slow change can be, right? And she also brings up, that slogan, the personal is political, and in a way, she said that's worked against us, because then it's encouraged us to uh, see ourselves and each other not just in terms of what we want to achieve, but whether we're the right kind of people. How pure we are, and how and so it makes it easy to tarnish someone's work by saying, well, look at the kind of person they are. Right? So that's what she said. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Oh, this happened in person to me, like with me as well. I was like, yeah, yeah. So it's not just, although it's safe. They feel safe. It's easy on Twitter when you have to look at someone. Um, well, one thing it's, I guess it plays out differently. I think in person, as in real life, it's gonna be more implicit and insidious. It's gonna be probably more things like they're excluding you, and it's kind of you probably get, it's like you get more of a sense that something's not quite right, rather than someone coming out and telling you. But um, so how would you, like, so you're saying if this happens, say in your, yeah. Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah. So look, I mean, there's various ways to deal with that. Like, you can, so you can sort of bring it back and be like, well, why would you say that? Sort of, sometimes it's like challenging them in a way that they don't expect, right? Because they might expect you to get angry or upset, or yes, I do, but sort of maybe saying like, oh, well, why would you think that I wouldn't? Trying to actually make them say why they would. Why would they think you wouldn't? Well, exactly, right? That's it. It's that plausible deniability. It's that, yeah, and then you can't take a joke, etc. Pushing it back onto you. Um, but you know, those. I mean, sometimes they are just microaggressions in the moment. Um, in which case, if it's part of something bigger, it's about kind of sit and have a real think about the environment you're in and what role sort of you play there. And yeah, awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much.